Hello, hi, welcome. This video is the continuation of Cloud Native Ninja series, and today we are going to see how to use Kubernetes deployment. So far in this series, we have done various things as part of the Cloud Native Ninja. We started with understanding what are the containers, how to build containers, what is the good use for making use of containerized software. And then we started building our application, which consists of a front end built using the React.js called as the TechTalks UI, and then we have TechTalks Producer and Consumer, which is built using polyglot programming model. We have created container images using .NET Core, Java, Go, and we also have a Rust version which I need to integrate into the code repository. We use a distributed application runtime called dapr, and this decouples our producer and consumer from the messaging layer, which is rabbitmq. In this video, we are going to see how to use deployments, which is one of the basic Kubernetes concept or a construct. Let's start by looking at what is a deployment. The definition of deployment from the Kubernetes website or kubernetes.io is it provides a declarative updates for pods and replica sets. We describe the desired state in a deployment, and the deployment controller changes the actual state of the system to the desired state. We can define deployments to create new replica sets and to remove the existing deployments, adopt all these resources. So how does this really work in reality? There are many things that are being discussed in this definition or highlighted in this definition. So let's do a sort of deep dive and see what does each of those things mean. Let's start with the smallest unit of building block or execution in Kubernetes, which is called as the pod. I also mentioned about this in the earlier video. So pod is the smallest unit, which is the executable unit in Kubernetes. It's a smallest application building block, and it shares one or more containers. If we look at the containers that we have created in the past, those have been standalone containers. We have created containers in Go, we have created containers in .NET and Java, and these are created as for our application, a producer container and a consumer container for our TechTalks application. When we talk about pod, it consists one or more containers, and along with that, it also shares a storage and the container or the networking resources. So a combination of one or more pods or containers and its associated storage and networking is what forms a pod. Deployment is a higher level construct. It's like a management tool which is used for controlling the behavior of the pods. We can define a template, how a pod should look like, or what should be the contents of the pod, how a container should be created using a template, and then deployment works with the replica set to make sure that that definition that we provide as part of our pod definition or a container definition is converted into what is called as a replica set. The main purpose of replica set is to maintain a stable set of replicas for running the pods. If we don't specify the number of replicas, by default, a deployment will create one replica for our container. But if we specify multiple replicas, then it is the deployment and the replica set working hand in hand to make sure that we have the required number of replicas running all the time. And this also guarantees that the availability of specified number of identical pods is there because it replicates the definition of a pod. So instead of wasting any more time, let's dive straight away into our Kubernetes cluster and see how does this work. If I run the kubectl get deploy command, we will see that last time when I created this sample deployment, my deployment, it is still running. It's been running for close to 6 days now. This was a Nginx deployment that we had created using one of the command available in Kubernetes documentation. Today we are going to deploy our own application onto this Kubernetes cluster. This Kubernetes cluster is running as part of Docker Desktop, and we had again discussed this in the previous video. So if you have missed the previous video, I recommend that you go back and understand what is Kubernetes and how does Kubernetes work. To get started, we are going to run Kubernetes create command or kubectl create command, and we will create a type of deployment. The name of this deployment would be TechTalks Producer deployment. We're going to create a container for our TechTalks Producer, and we give the image reference using this -- image flag, and we specify Nilesh Kule / TechTalks producer. And the version or the tag that we are going to use for this is the Go version. We have created this earlier in the series. So the version of the programming language or the programming language that I'm going to deploy this pod with is using Go. With this, the deployment is created. We can see the output there, which says the deployment.apps TechTalks producer was created successfully. Now to verify this, again, we can go and use the kubectl get deploy command, which we have run just earlier. And we can find that this deployment was created. We can see here TechTalks producer deployment is the name of the deployment as specified in our create command. One pod is ready, or this particular deployment has one container or one replica requested. So that is in the ready state and everything is available. So it took us it has been running for about 33 seconds. And this was created in split second as we saw. So now how can we verify apart from this what got created? So in the interest of time, again, I will be using some of the commands which I have created earlier or tested earlier. We can use one of the kubectl plugin here to get the state or the hierarchy of the deployment. As I said, when we create a deployment, it creates a replica set, and that replica set creates a pod. We have this plugin called as tree, which is available as part of Crew. I had done a video earlier how to manage Kubernetes or kubectl plugins using Crew. You can have a look at that video. So I've installed this plugin called as tree, which gives me the hierarchy or the tree in which this particular object structure is created. So we see that the namespace which is used is the default namespace. The type of object is deployment. The name of that deployment is TechTalks producer deployment. And underneath that is the replica set, which is named as TechTalks producer deployment. And there is a generated name given here or suffix attached to the deployment name. Same way for the pod, if we see there is the TechTalks producer deployment pod with the name of the replica set, and then again there is a suffix there which is auto generated. So this is how we can verify the hierarchy of the objects which are created. Once we have this, we can do a port forwarding. Now for doing the port forwarding, we also need to expose the ports for this deployment. Let's try to do this and see what happens. So our TechTalks producer deployment is listening on port 8080. I already have a listener here. That is why it is failing. So let me stop this and let me rerun that again. So now we are mapping port 8080 on our local host to port 8080 on the Kubernetes cluster. And once we have this, we can actually go and hit this particular endpoint or this URL. So we'll see this in a short while, how to access this. But before we go and access the producer deployment, I would like to perform some other operations like the deletion. How do we delete the deployment? So let's say you created the deployment and there was some problem with that. We have to delete that particular deployment. We can use the delete command and then give the name of the deployment which we want to delete. So we say kubectl delete, and the name of deployment in this case is TechTalks producer deployment. And the output of this is that the deployment has been deleted. Once we delete this, if we again run the kubectl get deploy command, we will see that we are back to the initial state where we started this video, and this particular TechTalks producer deployment has been deleted. The other thing we can do is to create the deployment with a set number of replicas. So let's go and create 2 replicas. And I'm going to use this command again here with another flag. So the initial part of the create deployment command remains the same, where we give the name of the TechTalks producer deployment, the image. And in addition to that, we specify -FN replicas, which indicates how many replicas do we want to create for our pod. I'm starting this with 2 replicas, and this is also created instantaneously. Again, if we go back to the get deploy command, we would be able to see that now instead of 1, which was the default, since we specified 2 replicas, 2 replicas have been created here and both are available for us. The other thing which we can do is, because ReplicaSet works to make sure that the number of requested replicas are always maintained. As we saw in the definition, there is the target state or the desired state and the current state. So if we look at the current state, we have a TechTalks producer deployment with 2 replicas running. What will happen if I go and delete one of the pod? So if we run, let's say, kubectl get pods, we will get the 2 pods which are part of this particular deployment. And let's go and delete one of these pods and see what happens. Because these pods are part of the replica set, once we delete them, my expectation is the replica set would recreate that pod. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this particular pod, which is ending with BZS9B. And let's go and do a kubectl get deploy again to see what happens. So the pod has been deleted here. When we run the kubectl get deploy again, now we see that there are 2 replicas up and running as normal. So we run the kubectl pods again, and what we will see that is there is a TechTalks producer deployment pod created. The one which we deleted has been replaced, and there was one which was created about 2.5 minutes ago, and the new one has been created about 1 minute ago. So with this, we can see that the replica set is maintaining that desired state for us. Since at the time of creation of our deployment, we said that we need 2 replicas, it is making sure that at any point in time, 2 replicas of our deployment are running. And this is one way to make sure that we have a highly resilient application. This allows us to make sure that the required number of replicas are running. The other benefit of having a high level construct like deployment is we can scale the deployment. Now currently we are having 2 pods running, or 2 replicas of our producer running. If I want to scale it to, let's say, 5, I can use this scale command with the name of the deployment and specify the number of replicas. This again goes back to the desired state and current state. Now when we run the kubectl get pods, what we should be able to see is there are 3 different times when the pods are created. We can see the TechTalks producer has 5 pods running, which means the 5 replicas are up and running. 3 of them have been created 10 seconds ago. This is that additional 3 replicas. So our current state when we ran this command was 2 replicas were already running. One was created more than 3 minutes ago. The other one was created more than 2 minutes ago. And since we asked Kubernetes to scale this deployment to 5 replicas, it found that there is a difference of 3 replicas here, and it has created those 3 replicas. Now if I go back and again reduce this down back to 2, it would delete the 3 replicas, additional replicas which have been created. So let's run this. We can see that the scale down has happened. And again, if we go back and run the kubectl get pods command, now we can see that there are only 2 producer deployments running here. One which was created about 4.5 minutes ago, and the other one which was created just over 3 minutes ago. So like this, we can manage the scaling as well for our deployments or for our workloads. Now this is all that we have done is using the imperative way of creating objects. I had done a video earlier again on how to use imperative commands with Kubernetes. These are good if we want to do things very quickly. like we want to create a very small deployment and we want to have number of replicas. But there is another approach, or there is another method which is quite useful in today's world, where we talk about everything as code, like infrastructure as code, and we are talking about GitOps and things like that, where any change that we do to our application is version controlled. And in that sense, Kubernetes provides us a way in which we can create a YAML file describing the contents of our deployment, or how we want to declaratively create our deployments, and then apply this deployment to our Kubernetes cluster. So here is an example for exactly the same thing that I created using the imperative commands. We start with the API version, kind, and metadata, which are common to most of the Kubernetes objects that we create. So we use the apps v1 version as the API version, kind is deployment, and then we specify some metadata like the rabbitmq producer deployment is the name for this particular deployment we are trying to create. We also specify some labels which are like key value pairs, and these helps us in identifying the deployment. So we will talk about these labels and things like the match labels and selectors in future versions of this series. For now, let's focus on the next part, which is the spec, which specifies what should be the deployment or how do we want our deployment to happen. This is where we specify the number of replicas as 2, and then we provide a template which is used for creating the deployment. The most important part of this is again the spec and the containers part. Whatever we specified on the command line as image now gets translated into this specification for creating the containers. The name of our container here that we want to create is TechTalks Producer. The image is the same image that I used on the imperative command, which is Nilesh Kohli TechTalks Producer with the tag as go. And then we specify the port. Now I want to expose the container port 8080 because that is where my application or my Go image is going to expose the container. And we also specify some resources. I had talked about this in the previous video as well. Resources help us to create a sort of constraints when the application is running. So we are saying when the application is about to schedule, or when Kubernetes is about to schedule the pod, we want the resources to be like 1% of the CPU core should be available and 200 MB of memory should be available on a particular node. And when it starts executing, once it has been scheduled on a particular node, the maximum it can use is 5% of the core and 500 MB. So Kubernetes controllers will make sure that our pod doesn't behave abnormally and it doesn't use resources outside of these resource limit. And we also specify image pull policy, which means that the image should be pulled every time the controller tries to schedule a pod on a particular node. And we also specify the restart policy along with other things like termination, grace period, and DNS policy. Now all this is part of the Kubernetes documentation. So to understand these things, we can go to the documentation. There are so many other things that the Kubernetes deployments can do. And I have also done a separate video or a series of videos in terms of the different strategies which can be applied to upgrade an application in Kubernetes. We have things like blue-green deployment, canary deployment, there is the recreate strategy. So all those are part of the way we manage the deployments in Kubernetes, and you can refer to those videos to understand better how we can have progressive delivery done with Kubernetes inbuilt constructs. Now, how to use this particular manifest file? We defined all these things in the YAML file. In order to create or make use of this particular YAML file, again, we can go back to the location where we have this YAML file created, and I will navigate to the folder directory or directory structure where that YAML file is created. Let's list it down. And then we can use the kubectl create command again. But this time, instead of giving the imperative command, I would be giving the file name. So I am in this directory, which is under K8s folder and TechTalks Producer, which has a TechTalks Producer or producer deployment.yml file, and there is a producer service.yml file. We'll talk about the service later in this series. For now, let's focus our energy on the TechTalks Producer deployment. Now, if we go back again and let's say kubectl get deploy to make sure that we have only one deployment running, let's go and delete this deployment which we created imperatively before we use the manifest file. So let me switch back to the earlier commands which were created, and let me go and use this delete command. This is just to make sure I don't do the typo which I happen to do quite a lot during the demos. So the deployment has been deleted now. Now let's go and apply this particular TechTalks producer. So to create the TechTalks producer, we need to use this producer deployment file along with the create command, and instead of giving the imperative command, we are passing the -f flag here to indicate that we are going to use a manifest file, and it should be YAML. Okay. So now we can see that using this particular YAML file and the definition that we provided in the YAML file, the rabbitmq producer deployment has been created. And if we run again kubectl get deploy command, it would show us that let's run the kubectl get deploy command, and we can see that the rabbitmq producer deployment with 2 replicas has been recreated. So here we can see that using the declarative approach, using YAML file, we can create the deployment or any other type of Kubernetes object. Now, when we do this, we might have many manifest files. All types of Kubernetes objects can be created using the manifest file. We can't use create for every file, and there has to be a better way of creating these objects. That is where we have the other approach, which is to use the apply command. Now the difference between the apply and create command is create will fail if the objects exist, whereas if we have the object already created and we make some minor modifications to the definition of that object, when we use apply command, it will incrementally apply the changes. So let's see an example of this where I want to change the 2 replicas to 3. And we go and use the apply command here. And let me change the YAML to YAML. Now, when I want to use the apply command, the syntax is similar to create, just that we use apply instead of create, and it will do a diff kind of operation to find out what is difference between the current state and the desired state, and it will apply the deployment. So here we can see that the rabbitmq producer deployment has been configured, and if we run the kubectl get deploy again, now it has applied that change and we have 3 replicas running. The other thing we can do with apply is, if we have multiple files in the directory, we can apply the command recursively. So we can use the recursive flag and the file name, the combination of these two, to create these things in recursive manner. Instead of giving every file name, we can use kubectl apply recursive flag and file name as dot, which means that it will use every file name in that directory and it will be passed as a input parameter to the apply command. So here we can see that the rabbitmq producer deployment is unchanged because we did not have any changes to the definition of our deployment, and service object did not exist. There were 2 files in this directory, if you remember. So it has applied the definition of the producer service, and as part of this particular project setup, I've gone ahead and created few objects that we need. So if you remember, we are using dapr, we are using rabbitmq, and I've used the Helm chart, which is a way to package Kubernetes applications to deploy this into our single node Kubernetes cluster. You can go through this particular PowerShell script to understand what are the prerequisites and how these are being applied. These are basically kubectl commands which are created as part of the PowerShell script. So I've deployed rabbitmq, I've deployed dapr onto the Kubernetes cluster. I've also deployed something called as the autoscaler, which is required for creating the secret for connecting to the rabbitmq cluster. And then I have deployed the dapr configuration. So I talked about this in the second or third part of this series. How do we configure dapr? So all these prerequisites have been done as part of setting up this demo. And finally, I also have a script for deploying the tech talks. So what we saw here was the part related to deploying the producer. Now let's run one thing, which is to expose this producer outside of the cluster. So if you go back to the commands, I was showing you earlier, there was this command for port forwarding. So this helps us to access our producer. Now if I go back to the producer again and run this command, we have the tech talks producer. Okay, it's the name rabbitmq producer. It's not called tech talks producer. So let me again update this. So we are going to do a port forwarding here, which will allow us to communicate with that particular deployment from our terminal. Now the deployment or the producer is running inside that single node Kubernetes cluster, and we are going to access it So the tech talks producer is running inside our Kubernetes cluster, and there should be some way for us to interact with that. One way we do that is by using port forwarding. Port forwarding allows us to map a port on our local machine to a port inside the Kubernetes cluster. So we have this deployment, which is rabbitmq producer deployment, which is exposing port 8080. That was our definition, where we specified in our manifest file that we want to expose port 8080. And then we are mapping that 8080 port to our local 8080 port on our computer. So now we have any request that goes on to port 8080 will be forwarded to the Kubernetes cluster. Let's go and test this. So for testing that, I've already created the rabbitmq in the cluster, and we have again forwarded to 15672 port, using which we can see what is the state of our rabbitmq cluster. Here if we see, there is this queue, and in the queue currently we don't have any messages. Our producer is the one which is going to produce messages onto this queue. So I have this utility which sends the request to that particular queue. Using our localhost 8080, we have our generate method, and I'm going to send 1000 messages or a request for creating 1000 tech talks. Let's send this request, and if we switch over back to our rabbitmq, we should be seeing a jump in the values here, and we should see some messages populated. So with that, we can verify that our producer is able to populate messages onto our rabbitmq using dapr, because we are also using dapr as the distributed application runtime layer here. Now, to use the consumer, or how to consume these messages, we need to deploy our consumer as well. For that, I have the script ready, as I was saying, and if we run that script, it will deploy the consumer. I would give this as a homework to you to understand how the consumer is, the manifest file is all these things are in the K8s folder. If you look at the TechTalks producer, similarly there is the TechTalks consumer. We have the deployment definition here, and then as part of my automation or the PowerShell scripts, I have a script which runs that. So let's deploy this. Deploy TechTalks PowerShell script, which will deploy the producer and the consumer. But since the producer is already there, we applied the same manifest file. The service and the deployment is unchanged, and it has gone ahead and deployed the consumer for us. Again, using the consumer's Go version, which we built earlier in the series. And if we go back to our rabbitmq UI, now we can see that there is one consumer, and it has picked up 50 messages for processing, because the batch size that we have specified in our rabbitmq dapr configuration is 50, which means that in a batch the consumer will pick 50 messages and process them. How we can verify this? If you remember, in the previous video I had shown how to use Octant as the visualizer for the Kubernetes cluster. We can use things like events. We can do describe command to understand what is going on inside our objects. But the easiest way I find is to use a tool like Octant or Lens, which I had shown earlier. Now we have the rabbitmq consumer running here, one instance of that or one replica of that running. We can go into the details of the rabbitmq consumer, and we can look at the logs of that. So in here we see one replica is running, and when we scroll down, it will show us that there is this image which is used, the Nileshpuri TechTalks consumer Go. I want to see the logs of this. So if we go into the pods, that will give us the pod logs. So the consumer pod, and under the logs we can see that for every message that is processed, it logs a certain information like the TechTalks ID, the consumer, what is the name, level, this kind of information is logged in the log, which means that our consumer is working fine, and that is how we are able to verify that these messages are getting consumed. If we keep watching this particular screen, we will also see that these number of ready messages and the total number of messages will keep reducing as and when the producer and as and when the consumer processes those messages. So with that, we can see that we are able to deploy, we are able to communicate with our rabbitmq using the rabbitmq deployed in our cluster, and the producer and consumer both are working. So this is an example, or this is the first step in which we deploy the objects or the application related components to a Kubernetes cluster. We have seen multiple ways of doing that, one using the imperative command and the other one using the manifest file, and also to interact with the components like rabbitmq and dapr. The last thing which I would like to show is we can also get things like the events, and we can also look at the one thing which I missed initially was the describe command. So if I take the deployment, we can use the kubectl describe command to get the description. So let's run kubectl get deploy command first and get the name of the deployment that we want to find the description about. So we were looking all this while at the rabbitmq producer deployment. Let's look at the details of rabbitmq consumer. So let me copy this name, and we can use this command kubectl describe. The name of the object that we want to describe, or type of object that we want to describe, is deployment. We can use a short form called deploy, and then we specify the name of the deployment. We are trying to find details about rabbitmq consumer deployment. Here we can see that it is in the default namespace. It was created at 6/6/1806. It has these labels app equal to tech talks and run equal to rabbitmq consumer and various other details. So this is another way in which we can find what are the details related to our Kubernetes object. Describe is the command which is used. The other option is obviously to use a visual way like the Octant or lens, and we can look at all these different objects available in our deployment or in our cluster. The last thing is if you want to delete everything, as I showed the apply command which can be run recursively, delete can also be run recursively. So you can select a folder or a folder structure hierarchy and you can run this kubectl delete command either using kubectl delete -- recursive, which is the long form and -- file name, or you can give a short form of the parameters -R and -F, and it would delete all the objects which are created as part of the manifest files which resides in this folder structure. Again, I would suggest you give this a try. That's like a homework for you to understand Kubernetes better, or the way we work with Kubernetes. So with that, I think we have covered almost all the things that I wanted to cover. We looked at the pod deployment and ReplicaSet. When we talk about deployment manifest, these are the main areas of the deployment manifest. First part is the API version, kind, and the metadata. Next is the specification or the spec for the ReplicaSet, and the last part is the specification for the pod template or the pod specification. Using all this information, we create a deployment object, and then that manages the lifecycle of our pods. So in summary, what we looked at in this video is a major part of it was dedicated to the Kubernetes deployments, which is a higher level construct for managing the pods. We had a brief look at the Kubernetes plugin, which was the tree plugin used to see the hierarchy of objects. Crew was the package manager used for installing that plugin. We also looked at the Kubernetes imperative command to do a quick deployment using some default values. And then we looked at the manifest file, which gives us much more control in terms of describing in a declarative manner what should be the content of our Kubernetes deployment. This is also a recommended way because it can be used with CI/CD pipelines. It can be used with the source control to have a track of what exactly goes on in our application, how it has evolved over a period of time. So with that, we come to the end of this video. The source code for this is available as part of the Cloud Native Ninja GitHub repository. All the commands that I executed are also part of the doc section, and for the 10th part of this series video. The slides used during this and all the previous sessions or videos is published to the SlideShare and speaker deck. I hope you found this useful. Thanks for watching this video. If you found anything useful in the video, please hit the like button, subscribe to my channel, and share it with your friends and family. Until next time, code with passion and strive for excellence.